North Side. I am really excited today to share this message with you with Corey Scott, who's going to be joining me today. In fact, can we just give it up for Corey right now? Woo! We love this guy and excited that we can team preach together. And I tell you what, one of the reasons I really wanted Corey to join.
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just,
Please, interrupt.
Why am I here? We were talking about this a little bit ago. This is actually the first time that we have ever team preached. Team taught, team preached.
Yeah. Together.
Yeah, 18 years.
Yeah.
18 years.
First time we're doing it.
Yeah.
There's a first for everything. Here, and it's going to happen.
We're breaking new ground, Copernicus.
We're breaking new ground right here.
That's right.
So, but I'll tell you why I'm excited about this, Corey, is because of anybody I know. I felt like this would be the message that I would want you to team preach, because of anybody I know, Corey really knows how to get out of work. And so that, I don't know if that came across the way I intended.
Yeah, it did. I think it did.
You think it did?
Yeah.
Let me say it this way. Corey has spent a lot of time over this past year reading, growing, and even doing some teaching about rest. Ceasing work. Anybody here feel like you could use some rest? Do you just want to put it that? Can you use some rest? Me too. I've got great news for you today from Hebrews chapter 4. God is telling you there is rest for you. There's rest for you. And some of you are going, no, there's not. There's no time to rest. Trust me, there's no rest for me. And God is going to tell you today, yes, there is. There is rest for you. The problem isn't so much that you can't rest. The problem is probably that you value productivity and busyness more. I'll give you kind of an example of this. It's revealed in our answers to people's questions. Like, Corey, if I ask you, Corey, how's it going? How you doing?
Good. I'm busy.
Yeah, me too.
Just clicking along.
Busy. Mm-hmm. And then we spend the next few minutes each justifying to each other why we're so busy. I'm wondering, why do we do that? Do you think it's because we're just programmed to think that somehow busyness is a more respectable answer?
Right. I mean, if you were to look kind of underneath the surface of that question, or the answer to that question, I think you would probably find a little bit of pride. We like being able to say, oh, I'm busy. Yeah, just clicking along, Because what's the alternative? I'm not doing anything. I'm lazy. So we like to be able to let people know that we're busy. Maybe we feel a little bit of that stress or anxiety if we're not overly busy, like because we're supposed to be, And I think that's a problem. I remember a long time ago, one of our elders, Greg Stevenson, he's one of our vocalists, and so he asked me one time, he said, Corey, how you doing? And I said, fine. He's like, no, really, how you doing? And I said, I'm good, Greg, I'm busy, but it's all good stuff. All good stuff. And he said something that I hope I never forget. He said, right, and you can die if all you get is oxygen. In other words, if you just continue to take on more and take on more and take on more, even if it's good, but you never have the opportunity to release or to rest or exhale, you can suffocate. And I'm really glad that it was one of our elders here, one of our leaders, who prompted that discussion, that he was sensitive to that. Because not every organization, certainly not every church, has that as a part of its leadership culture. Even Alan Tiger, our college-age minister, was talking about this. He said, in some churches, if you break even one of the 10 commandments, you could get fired for that. He goes, except for one of those commandments. If you break the command of Sabbath, you actually might get promoted. If you never rest, you just work all the time. I think that's a problem.
Yeah,
it's a big problem.
Yeah. St. Gregory, in his book, Rules on Discipleship, said, sometimes our vices can be perceived as virtues. One of the examples he said was, you could come across to people like, man, you're incredibly frugal with your money. And actually, it's just disguising greed in your heart. The other example he gave is, on the surface, some people can look incredibly efficient, productive, but it is just concealing the vice of haste, of a hurried life, a rushed life. one that's addicted to productivity. Corey and I were listening to Shane Wood this week during the Preaching Teaching Convention, and Shane shared a personal story, his story of haste. And as we listened to that, I just felt like there's an element of all of us in his story. He talked about this fact. He said he received 2 bachelor's degrees in 4 years of his undergraduate study at Ozark Christian College. It's not because he came in with so many credit hours. He actually took 34 credit hours in 1 semester. He went on to describe that when he went on to do his master's work, he was taking 20 hours per semester while married, with children, in a full-time, in youth ministry, also as a teaching assistant, while he was also doing part-time in a Christian band, playing in a band and traveling. And he was praised for this. Professors and pastors and friends, they were just like, man, you're incredible. This is amazing what you're accomplishing. Like he was doing, like this was something good. And he says, so that was really a conflict in his spirit when he went to the doctor because he had tingling in his pinkies. And it was hard for him to breathe. And the doctor said, describe for me what your days are like, your schedule. And the doctor said, not only do I know your problem, but I know the solution. I want you to cut out half of what you're doing. And so he said, cut out half of what I'm doing. And he says, yes, you're hyperventilating. You're dealing with, I know I get up at 2 a.m., but everybody does that, right? And the doctor said to him, you got to cut out half of what you're doing. And he said, I don't want to let people down. I don't want to shortchange ministry. I'm not going to do that. And he said, well, here's a prescription for antidepressants, and I'll see you in 9 months or less. And Shane said, sure enough, it didn't improve. It got worse. When Shane went on to pursue his PhD, they said, we'll give you 7 years to complete your program. And Shane said, I'm going to do it in 4, even though he had 3 kids and 1 on the way. And so finally the day came when Shane was sitting at home and the diploma arrived in the mail. And as he was opening it, and his wife came into the room and saw what he was opening, she said, is that it? He said, yeah. She's like, how does it feel? And with tears in his eyes, Shane said, not like what I thought. And maybe for the first time in his life, he began to realize he had been masking and hiding and distracting himself from some realities that actually needed to be dealt with in his heart. That there was some brokenness there that he had just been trying to ignore. And in that moment, it began to come to the surface. It began to come to light. And I think in that moment, he would have to say that he had, in what appeared to be this virtuous efficiency, was actually the vice of haste in his life. And I think every single one of us have been there. And Corey, I think something must be wrong if we need rest, but our actions don't show at all that we seem to value it.
I would even argue that sometimes it's masked just by, we think, we justify things and we say, well, I'm only like 1 degree off of where I need to be. 1 or 2 degrees off of where I need to be with this particular spiritual discipline. What's the big deal? But what we don't realize is that 1 or 2 degrees off eventually will take us to a place where we're just way off track. I think we understand this kind of tension, but I feel like we don't always employ the solution that Scripture provides for us. And our text today leans into that solution. So if you have a Bible or device handy, I want to encourage you to turn to Hebrews chapter 4 as we continue this study through the book of Hebrews. I want you to see this for yourself. Hebrews 4 is the main text, and I'm going to read verse 1 here. It says this, the writer of Hebrews says, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful. Be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. It's a good word.
I love how it says, his offer of rest still stands. It still stands. It's not expired. It's not out of stock. It's not out of date. It still remains. God has an offer of rest for each and every one of you. You just have to seize it. You've got to believe it. You need to lean into it. And this is the message of Hebrews 4. In fact, it goes on to say in verse 2, for we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they, the Israelites, did in their day. He said, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. The writer is referring back to when they were supposed to go into the promised land, but they didn't trust God. They didn't believe God to do it. And so they didn't get to enter his rest. They ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't obey. In fact, there's a little phrase that I think would be good for you just to have in your mind through this entire message, and it's this: faith is the prerequisite of rest. Faith is the prerequisite of rest. If you want to enter into God's rest, we have to have faith. And that's what he goes on to explain. In verse 3, it says, now we who have believed in who? In Jesus, trusted in Jesus. That's what Hebrews 4 is about. Every chapter preceding that is all about Jesus. He says, when you believe, you enter that rest. Just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they, those Israelites who didn't trust him, shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. What's he saying? He's saying God rests. He values rest, and he commands us to rest. He even told Moses in Deuteronomy to rest. But the only people who get to experience it are people who first believe in Jesus, because he's accomplished for them what they could never do for themselves. He saved them from their sins. They don't have to work for salvation. He has saved them. So they got to live by faith. So in Hebrews chapter 4, there's three pictures of rest, overarching pictures that we're going to point out for a minute that kind of help us think about rest. The first one is this. He says, in the beginning of time, God rested at the completion of creation. He worked for 6 days. He rested on the seventh. Corey, you would say that's even a theme of Genesis 1.
Genesis 1, I mean, a lot of times when we think of Genesis 1, we think of like science textbook. Genesis 1 was not written as a science textbook, though I do believe it is scientifically accurate. It's actually a poem. It's a Hebrew poem. When you look at the structure, you can see the layout of that poem. It starts out, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, it says. The Hebrew mind would have seen that phrase, formless and void, as resting. Everything was resting. There's no activity. Fast forward to day 7. On the seventh day, God rested. Rest at the beginning, rest at the end. The Hebrew brain would have looked at that and go, oh, I need to look in the middle here, because that same idea is reflected in the middle. Verse 14 talks about day 4 of creation. God makes special times, special seasons. The Hebrew brain would have looked at that and said, Sabbaths, rest. So we have rest, rest, rest. The theme of Genesis 1 is rest. And remember, when God delivered that word to his people for the very first time, through his servant Moses, at the Mount Sinai, and it's after 400 years of slavery, 400 years of the people being told, you are what you produce. And God's first words to his people are, no you're not. You are who I say you are. You are my treasured possession, and you can rest in trust in that. From the very beginning, we see that rest is a big deal to God. Oh, sure, he worked for 6 days, right? I mean, work matters, but he also chose a day for rest. Some of us who are type A driven personalities, we might say, well, what's the big deal? It's just a day. What's one day? Well, look at it this way. Let's say that you take your entire annual salary, and you take 1/7 of that salary, and you just throw it away. Do you think you would feel that? I think probably so. And yet so often that's what we do with Sabbath. Just throw it away. What's the big deal? It's just one day. It's 1/7. Who cares? God cares. It's a big deal. He established it from the very beginning. But not just at the beginning, because when we think of rest, a lot of times our brains go to the end of time. And Wayne, I know you have spoken a lot on over the years on end times and Revelation. So maybe you can lean into that.
Yeah, so this picture in Hebrews that the Israelites are going to enter into the promised land, that was their rest that was available to them, is a picture of what awaits each and every one of us if we put our faith in Jesus. There is rest, there's a promised land, there's heaven for us as well. That there's this parallel storyline going on. Just as there was rest available to them, there's rest available to you if you have faith to believe it. And so in Hebrews 4, 8 through 11, it goes on to describe this, and it says, for if Joshua had given them rest, in the Old Testament there, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. There's several aspects to rest here, layers of it that he's talking about, but one of those that I want to hit on first is that in the end of time, we've talked about the beginning of time there was rest. Well, at the end of time, believers will rest in the finished work of redemption. When everything is redeemed, when everything that is wrong about this world is made right, when Jesus comes back and then he gives the new heaven and the new earth, there is going to be rest for us. All the pain, the toil, the suffering, the degradation, the decay, it'll be redeemed. There's rest. And so that's why in Revelation 14, it tells us that if you are following the ways of the world and following Satan, there's no rest for you. That's what hell is. There's no rest. But for those who are faithful in Jesus to the end, there is rest for you. That's how heaven is described for us. Now, that doesn't mean inactivity. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It doesn't mean boredom. We will produce in heaven. We will create in heaven. There will be work in heaven. But there's going to be rest like you've never experienced before. There's going to be rest the way God intended, without the suffering, pain, and toil. There's going to be rest where that rest that Corey was alluding to, that he commanded on the Sabbath, that we have a day of rest, where it will be brought to complete fulfillment the way it ought to be. The Sabbath should be a day that is a day of delight. That's what rest means, delight and joy. Sabbath happens when we feast and play and dance and sing. It happens when we pray and laugh and tell stories, when we paint and when we go for a walk, when we sit and watch creation as God created it. But we're too busy to enjoy a day of delight and joy like that. We're too busy to do it. And that's why God is promising you ultimate, perfect, eternal rest that goes beyond your comprehension. It's the kind of rest that Russ Adkins, a longtime member of Northside who passed away on Tuesday. His funeral was on Friday. His gravesite is today in Iowa at 3 o'clock. It's why people, when they're thinking about rest and talking about rest, will actually use the words rest in peace. Because they know that's what he's experiencing already in the presence of Jesus. He's experiencing rest as he's never experienced it before. Because Jesus has already done the work for him. And he's providing the rest for him. He just needs to enter into it. In Revelation 21:6, Jesus said, it's done. It's done. It's complete. It's finished. There's rest for us because it's done. That's his promise, that our Sabbath rest is in him. It's done.
I'll step in for just a second here because what is powerful to me with that kind of realization is this: God knows when to stop working. God knows when to stop. Think about this. God created the entire universe in 6 days. Can you imagine what kind of chaos and disorder there would be if he hadn't stopped for 5,000 years? Yes, I'm a young earth creationist, okay? Sue me. Don't sue me. Can you imagine what kind of chaos if he didn't know when to stop? Think about Noah and the flood. God floods the entire earth in a matter of days. Can you imagine what kind of chaos we would have if he didn't know when to stop making it rain? God knows when enough is enough. And you think of even Jesus on the cross. As he's hanging on the cross and he echoes those words from Psalm 22, it is finished. The work is done. It is accomplished. I believe this is a sign of God's wisdom. He knows when to stop. He knows when enough is enough. And I think the question for us today, as we look at this text, is do we know when enough is enough? Do we know how to stop?
Yeah, so let's try to define rest. Because rest can be defined in many ways, and we understand that. There's nuances to it. But here's how we're going to define rest today that's based and rooted in Hebrews chapter 4. We're defining it like this. The will of God brought to completion. That's how we're defining rest. The will of God brought to completion as we align with His will. That's rest. So in the beginning, when He completed creation, He rested. His will was complete. At the end of time, when He completes redemption, we rest. But there is also a rest for us, according to Hebrews, that's right now. Hebrews 4:7 says God has set today, a certain day, today, for us to rest. Right here, right now. It's built into the rhythm of our life when we put our faith in Jesus, but also as we live according to His will and His word. So point number three is this. In the middle of time, where we live right now, in the middle of time, there is rest for the faithful Christian. Maybe you haven't experienced the rest the way God wants you to, because maybe you haven't been faithful in this area of your life. God has commanded you to rest. In Deuteronomy, He told Moses, observe the Sabbath, the day of rest. So if you want to know God's will for your life, well then rest. That's in God's will. Hebrews 4:11 says, make every effort to enter that rest. That sounds ironic. You need to plan for this. You need to be intentional about this kind of rest. You need to do something about this. In fact, it takes effort to do three things on Sabbath day, on rest day. Those three things are to pray, to play, and have no work. That takes some intentionality. That takes some planning, some preparation. And I'm not sure until I was really wrestling with Hebrews 4 that I really thought about it in this way. That it takes effort and intentionality, maybe even some forethought and planning to play and pray and have no work.
It seems like a paradox.
Yes.
It seems like a paradox where we have to actually put forth effort in order to rest. It sounds like work. It sounds like obedience. And it is, and that's okay. But Wayne, I want you to think for just a second here about the Ten Commandments, okay? So let's dive into the Ten Commandments, and let's see if we can list them off here. And I know maybe put you on the spot, but I would imagine that you probably have hand motions.
Absolutely.
To help you remember the Ten Commandments.
I was a youth minister. Of course I have hand motions.
Oh, goody.
Okay, so here we go. Number one. He's number one.
Are we supposed to do this? Are we?
Sure, you do with me. Okay. Have no other gods before me, he says. He's number one. Have no other gods before me. Number two, it's like scissors. Do not make for yourself an idol. It's like you're cutting out the idol. Do not make for yourself an idol. Number three, words. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Okay, it's your speech. Number four, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's in our modern day version. These are wheels on a car going to church.
A car?
It's a car. It's not a crab. It's a crab. Slowing down. It's wheels. Four.
Your cars look like that, don't they? They look just like that.
Yeah. Okay, number five, Scout's honor.
Oh.
Honor your father and mother.
Okay, stop there for a second. Honor your father and mother. And the verse goes on, okay? Honor your father and mother. What follows that?
That it will go well with you.
That it will go well with you,
blessed.
right? So there is a promise that's associated with that command. And look, if we had time and we could, listen to everybody's stories, I would imagine that some of you would say, yeah, I've tried to do what my parents said and it did not work out well for me, okay? I get it. That for one reason or another, whether it's a parent's sin or someone else's sin that comes in, it can distort that picture. I get that. But I think that what God is doing here with this command is He is establishing a principle. And the principle is this. When you obey, when you do things God's way, more often than not, it works out better for us. When I enter into obedience, I experience rest because, as we defined it earlier, I am aligning my will with the good will of God. That's what obedience is. I am aligning my will with the good will of God, and there's rest in that. But when I enter into disobedience, I find this unrest and this discord in my heart. If I tell a lie, I have to remember who I told that lie to. Doesn't sound like rest. If I cheat on my taxes, I have to hope and pray that the IRS doesn't catch it. If we are watching filth on Netflix, I got to remember, erase the viewing history. If I blow up on someone at work, just hope it doesn't get to HR again, those kinds of situations. There is unrest. There is discord when we're not aligning with God's will. God knows that faith and obedience are the way to live in his rest, even if that comes with great effort. That's why the writer of Hebrews would tell us in verse 11, strive for this. Make every effort to enter into that rest. Because look, if we're just waiting for a feeling of rest to wash over us, it probably won't come. But if we align ourselves with God's good will, then I think that we will experience that rest. Wayne, I do want to put you on the spot here because these moments for me are few and far between. And it's been 18 years, so you're due. I have a question for you. When was the last time you could remember having a good long day of rest?
I feel like you're fishing for confession. That's what I feel like is happening right now. No, it's a good question.
It's okay, because I could
actually.
No, Acts 3 says, that confess your sins to one another, that times of refreshing may come from the Lord. I just thought you might want to be refreshed in front of everybody.
Yeah. I'm just glad you're biblical, as some people would say. Biblical. Actually, yesterday was really seriously, was a pretty good day of rest.
That's convenient.
It was really convenient. When I think of the three things we talked about earlier, right? Play, no work, pray.
Yeah.
When you ask a question like that, you do have to kind of think. And I will say, a play day that was kind of refreshing for me actually really was a week from yesterday. Kim and I, we got up that morning, and it was the sun was shining, the snow from Snowmageddon was starting to melt, and it was beautiful, and we had our coffee, and it was just steaming out of the
balmy 18 degrees.
18 degrees outside, it was so warm. And we drove the back roads to Pittsburgh, Kansas, where some friends of ours, their daughter was playing in her first college volleyball game. So we went to watch. And then we just drove down the road to my parents, my mom's birthday, and we just had lunch with them. And it was kind of one of those days for us. It was just a getaway day. That was a play kind of day. And that really was refreshing for us. When we try to do no work, it's one of those things, honestly, it's almost like we just have to get away. Mm-hmm. And I think one of our favorite places is to go to my in-laws' place at the lake. It's a beautiful place. We love to go there. It takes about a day and a half to even just kind of unwind. But to put a fire in the fire pit and sit out there and just really no work is something we cherish and we don't do enough. When it comes to pray, we have our lead staff on our staff team. We are encouraged to take a day every month. We call it a spiritual retreat day. And it's on the church's time where we say, this isn't PTO or vacation. Go and get away for a day and spiritually retreat. Be intentional about it, but pray, read, use that to rest. I can't remember the last month I actually did it. So it is a confession that this is an area that is hard for me to truly seize and to follow that command to make effort to do this. I do need to put more effort into doing it.
Yeah. Well, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but obviously there's others of us on the staff who struggle with this as well. And this was not in our notes, but I am thinking about on those times when our staff will post, in our Google chat, someone's like, I'm taking spiritual retreat day today. And I'll be just very honest. There's a part of me that's like, wouldn't that be nice? Mm-hmm. Where's that coming from? Even my wife and I were talking about this yesterday, that for all the reading, for all the study and focus on this particular topic right here that I have had in the last year, I still have so much room to grow on this, I think it's maybe hard for some of us, many of us, to think about when was the last time we really spiritually retreated? When was the last time we had a good long day of rest? I think that when we ignore this discipline, we are missing God's blessings and we are replacing them with our busyness. And those don't exchange very well. We run the risk of confusing activity with advancement. We confuse productivity with pursuing the kingdom, and those are not always the same things. And I think that it's this confusion that we have on this matter that leads to so much frustration in our lives. So what I'd like us to do is look at, kind of frame up this idea of Sabbath. You remember, if you study the book of Hebrews, you kind of have to put on your little Jewish yarmulke, your little Jewish skull cap when you study this, right? So let's look at, from a Hebraic standpoint, what does Sabbath mean? What are the three purposes of Sabbath? Well, the first one is kind of like what we've been talking about. It's rest. Mm-hmm. Rest. Stop working and rest. Jesus leans into this idea in Matthew chapter 11. At the end of that chapter, he talks about, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I'm humble in heart. Jesus is giving us rest. That's the end of chapter 11. It goes on into chapter 12, and there are two encounters that Jesus has in Matthew chapter 12, and they're both about the Sabbath. Verses 1 through 8, Jesus is reminding us that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He's in charge of this whole thing called Sabbath. And the second encounter is verses 9 through 14. He's in the synagogue, and a man comes in, and you remember he came in, he had a withered hand, and the Pharisees are watching Jesus, trying to trap him to see if he's going to go to work on the Sabbath, if he's going to heal somebody on the Sabbath. And sure enough, because Jesus doesn't overly care what the Pharisees think, he heals this man in front of everybody, and it says that his hand was fully restored. And then the Pharisees are just livid. And so Jesus speaks up and he says, hold on, listen. Even if you guys had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't you do the work of getting that thing out? How much more then for a child of God? And so he says this, Jesus makes a point. He says, it is permitted to do good on the Sabbath. What I love about this encounter is that Jesus is combining these two ideas, rest, the ceasing of work, and doing good, doing right, living a righteous life before God. You see, biblical rest is this very multifaceted spiritual discipline. There's so much that we could be talking about. I realize that as we talk about rest, we're just scratching the surface here, but Wayne, there are a few other things that I'd like for you to lean into as it regards to rest.
As we begin to think about, what are ways that we're resting? I think we could say this. Well, rest occurs when the finished work of God is remembered by us with thanksgiving, and it's anticipated with hope. Anytime we remember the works of God with thanksgiving and we anticipate his works with hope, that is rest. Rest occurs when the people of God enter into a place of worship and we come before his throne of grace with confidence and we worship him boldly. That's rest. You will walk out of here today feeling better than when you came. Because there's a rest that occurs when we gather together. It's happening right now. Rest occurs when the people of God live ethically. When we submit our lives to the will of God and we're saying, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, there's rest that occurs, not just in our own lives individually, but even corporately when we're all living for the Lord. Rest happens. It occurs in that moment, even by our definition, when the will of God is brought to completion, we rest. When we're living out the will of God and participating in it, rest occurs when we slow down, when we pause, when we observe, when we watch what creation is doing, when we walk, when we read, when we listen. Even when we do probably one of the most spiritual things we could do today, maybe it'll be this afternoon, maybe early evening. Take a nap, sleep. Sleep can be rest.
That sounds really good right now. Cloudy day,
Yeah.
Maybe a cup of coffee or something like that. We need that. I think it's helpful even just to remember that rest is a gift from God. Like, man, if we can hold on to that, rest is a gift from God. Psalm 127, verse 2 says, God gives rest to his beloved. He gives rest to those that he loves. It's a gift. And gifts should be received, not rejected. I have to remind our children of this. And right now, it's our 5-year-old Caleb. Whenever we put him to bed, it's not uncommon for me to lay him down and go, hey, buddy, remember, rest, sleep, that's a gift from God. He wants to give it to you right now. But you need to receive it. Like any gift, you've got to receive it. Do you want to know how you receive it, little buddy? Here's how you receive it. You have to stop fidgeting. You have to stop talking. I need you to stay in your bed. I said stop talking because God wants to give you this precious... Stop talking! On a serious note, I wonder how many of us are just missing this precious gift because we are ignoring God's instruction. And just say, when he says, just stop talking. Some of us need to hear that a lot. Stop talking. Stop fidgeting. Stop the activity. Just receive this gift. So rest is a major part of Sabbath. Here's the second part of Sabbath, and that is restoration. Restoration. Now, there is a difference between being rested and being restored. Just because you've stopped doesn't mean you are being restored. Confession time for everybody here. Have any of you ever been driving? You come to an intersection, a stoplight, you stop, complete stop, and while you're waiting for the light to turn green, you continue to look over at the perpendicular light to see when it's turning yellow so you know when to take your foot off the brake and go. Anybody? Raise your hand. Anybody do that? Thank you. Appreciate your honesty. Yeah, I do that too, right? Okay, are you stopped? Yes. Are you being restored? No. Because you're constantly thinking about the next thing. There is a difference between resting and being restored. Jesus, when he heals that man with the withered hand there in Matthew 12, it says that his hand was fully restored. I can't help but think that Matthew is connecting some dots for us about Sabbath and restoration. The goal, God's ultimate goal for this world and his creation is restoration. He's going to make old things new. He's going to make old things new. That's what he wants to do. That's the essence of being restored. And I think Hebrews is leaning into that through our faith and obedience, we can enter a rest for today. Something that will restore us, breathe new life into us. Well, there's a third purpose of Sabbath. We got to slow down, have some margin so we can do this. Remember. Remember. The call to remember is often found in Scripture. The ultimate one, of course, would be just Jesus' own memorial, the memorial that he established in the remembering of his sacrifice through the Lord's Supper. We'll do that here after a little while. Do this in remembrance of me. In Sabbath, our bodies are resting, but God calls our brains into work. He calls our minds into work to remember what he's done for us, to recount the things that he's done for us. I'm sure if you all are like me at all, you probably have hundreds of photos on your phone, right? Some of you maybe thousands. One of the things that my precious wife will do on occasion is she will take the photos on her phone and she'll couple them with the photos on my phone, and then we work together to pick the best ones that we want to keep, and then we actually upload them to Walgreens and print them off. And then we drive to Walgreens and we pick up all 12 boxes of them, and we drive across the street to Hobby Lobby and we pick up a new photo album, and we go home and we take the time to gently stuff them in there. And every once in a while, a kid will go over to the cabinet there in our living room and pull out one of those photo albums and begin to thumb through. We're not just looking at photos, are we? We're remembering. We're remembering. We might be resting on the couch, but we're calling our brains into work. And here's the thing. As we remember who we are. Memory clarifies our identity. Memory clarifies our identity. That's why the scriptures tell us to remember. We forget who we are. We forget who God is. Sabbath gives us space to remember. I think it goes this way every time we receive one of the newsletters from one of our global workers. They turn in a newsletter and they just remember what God has done in the last month. In fact, I want to encourage all of you to go out to our Global Outreach wall out here in our Go lobby, and there's recent newsletters. Take one and begin to become aware of what God is doing and pray for them. Jim and Terry Riley, our workers in Honduras, recently sent us a great newsletter about the stuff that's going on there, especially with the hurricane relief there in Honduras that they're still working through. And so I called Jim about a week and a half ago, and we had a Zoom chat and recorded that. And so we're actually going to be throwing that video out to you all in an email this week. I want to encourage you to watch that so that you can recount with Jim about the goodness of our God, because that's what remembering does. We recount the wonderful deeds of the Lord again and again and again. It helps us remember who we are in Christ so that we don't forget, because the world is telling us all kinds of other messages about who we are. We'll pay attention to that, but maybe ignore the voice of our Good Shepherd who's trying to help us remember. I just want to close with this today. Years ago, when our kids were still pretty little, I attended a conference. It was a songwriters conference. Leah and the kids came with us, or we all came together, and I would go to the conference during the day. They'd stay at the hotel. And I remember I brought a song that I had written for this part of the conference where it was a competition, songwriters competition. I submitted it. I don't remember the last time in my life that I've ever felt so torn up. Like the judges just ripped it to shreds. Like I thought, they weren't unchristlike about it, but they certainly kind of let my ego have it. And I thought, man, I can't write a song to save my life. And right after that, we went into the worship center and they had a concert with all of the weekend staff writers. And they would present these songs that they had written. And I'm sitting there, song after song after song after song, going, I am in the wrong place. Like, I do not belong here. These songs are amazing. I can't write songs, God. No more songs for me. Sorry. I remember getting in the van to drive back to the hotel, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but I am weeping. Because I just felt so discouraged, so worthless. I can't produce a thing. And I remember I went up to the hotel room. Leah and the kids were not there. There was a little sticky note on the bed. Note from Miss Leah. It just said, get your trunks on. Come join us in the pool. Kiss, kiss, hug, hug, little kids, I thought, I don't feel like swimming. I've already been swimming in grief and misery. But I got my trunks on and I went down to the pool. I swiped my card. I opened the door. My family was the only one in there. And as soon as I walked in there, all the kids looked at me and they just said one thing. Daddy! They had no idea what I had just been through. They didn't know. But in that encounter, I learned something from the Lord. My value does not come from what I produce. My value comes from who they say I am. Are you following me? Our value does not come from what we produce in this world. Working for the Lord and putting out effort for the Lord is good. God works 6 days. It's good. But our value does not come from what we produce. It comes from who God says we are. That's why the title of this message matters. Jesus is our rest. He is our identity. Our sufficiency is in Him. And every morning, I find myself on my knees in a posture of prayer, and I pray a simple prayer, and it goes like this. Jesus, today, I want to discard the identity that I have tried to fashion for myself. And I want to put on your identity. I want to put on your name, the name Christian. I want to wear that name. I want to stand, I want to rise, and I want to live out that name today. That's our identity in Jesus. And maybe for some of us today, we have just completely forgotten that. We have no margin, we have no space in our lives to remember who we truly are. Maybe today is the day for you to go, I don't even know where to start, but I want this. I know Wayne and I would love to pray with you and to talk with you in our decision point out these double doors. Or if you're watching online, you can go on our website, northsidechristianchurch.net/decision, and you can ask your questions and make your prayer requests. We'd love to hear from you. Some of you have cards in the seat pockets in front of you. If you don't want to meet with us today, that's fine. Fill out a card, put it in the box, and we'll contact you later on. But today is a day that we rediscover who we are in Jesus. He is our rest. We pray that you find that rest today. Can we stand together, church, and let's acknowledge who we are in Jesus.